Great. So with that, let me first invite our first speaker for the evening, Julia Kennedy, Director, Indo-Pacific Office at USAID India, for her welcome remarks. Julia is the Director, Indo-Pacific Office, as I just mentioned. Before this, she was also holding the position of Deputy Director at the Clean Energy and Environment Office in USAID India. Before coming to India, she's worked in Haiti and with the Department of State climate change negotiation teams, as well as with the US Embassy in Chad. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Julia. So over to you for your welcome remarks.
Thank you so much, Manali. Sorry, I'm having a brief technology issue. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you also.
Okay, thank you. It's saying that my connection is potentially about to cut. So hold on for one moment while I make sure that I am still here. I apologize.
Sure, maybe in that meantime, can I request all the speakers to put down their cameras and we can do a photo op and give Julia some time also to resolve the issue. Can I ask, Anurag, Mohit, Atul, Ipshita, Pramod, please put on your camera. And if Ipshita, whenever you are done, just give me a thumbs up. Anurag? Okay, so please go ahead. Let's all smile for the camera.
I think Anurag's video is still off.
Yeah. Please go ahead and take one.
Okay. Done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, wonderful. And I'm now smiling because my Wi-Fi is back on. So apologies to everyone for that delay. So if Manali, should I go ahead now?
Yes, please.
Okay, excellent. So good evening to those of you joining us from South and Southeast Asia, and good morning to participants from the US and other parts of the world. On behalf of USAID, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual side event on decarbonization pathways in South Asia here at the Asia Clean Energy Forum. I am delighted to be here today with Professor Kirit Parikh, former member of the Government of India's Planning Commission and Chairman of Integrated Research and Action for Development, Dr. Rakesh Sirwal, Additional Secretary at Niti Aayog from the Government of India, Mr. Sulakshuna Jawardena, the Director General of the Sri Lanka Sustainable Energy Authority, Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, Fellow at the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, Mr. Joe Phelan, the India Director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and Mr. Akhtar Hussain Al-Purbo, the Director of the Bangladesh Knitwear Manufacturers and Exporters Association. And then, of course, all of the other participants who are joining us today. This is the decisive decade for action against climate change, and we must come together to build back a better future. As the world begins to recover from the pandemic, we have a unique opportunity to take bolder, faster, and more immediate action towards deep decarbonization to accelerate a clean energy transition and limit global warming. The Biden-Harris administration has launched pioneering climate efforts to implement jointly on the ground with partner countries in an effort to reduce emissions, sustainably develop economies, and increase climate resilience. USAID has in fact been supporting Asia's transition to a low-carbon economy for decades by promoting efficiency, productivity, and environmental stewardship. For example, in 2010, USAID launched the Global Climate Change Initiative, and since 2018, we've supported clean energy transitions across the Indo-Pacific. In South Asia alone, our programs have helped mobilize over $2 billion for clean energy development in the past 6 years and supported 10 gigawatts of new generation capacity into the grid. To put that into perspective, 10 gigawatts of new generation can power 6.5 million households. As the global climate crisis intensifies, we are redoubling our efforts to advance decarbonization enhance energy security, expand access to renewable energy resources, and create vibrant, fair, and competitive energy markets. This is good for the economy and good for society. Towards this end, USAID recently launched the Energizing a Net Zero Asia initiative that totals over $200 million and commits us to establishing a net zero energy grid in Asia. In South Asia itself, our support includes technical assistance, knowledge sharing, institutional strengthening, and capacity building, as well as rigorous analysis and modeling focused around enhancing energy security, diversification, and decarbonization. We have 3 regional programs that specifically target these goals, and Manali has already mentioned a few of them. So the South Asia Regional Energy Hub is a coordination and communication platform that assists USAID in collating, analyzing, and better communicating its energy programming efforts in South Asia while promoting knowledge exchange within the region. The second regional activity, the South Asia Group for Energy, is a consortium of US Department of Energy national laboratories that will work collaboratively to support USAID's efforts in South Asia. SAGE combines expertise from the National Renewable Energy Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and the Pacific Northwest National Lab to address some of the core issues that the region faces. Through SAGE, our focus is to bring the best of US knowledge and expertise to support South Asian institutions, and SAGE will provide a formal platform for collaboration on resilient power grids, a clean energy transition, the decarbonization of energy-intensive sectors, and potentially the just transition from coal, to name just a few of the opportunities. Finally, our third and largest activity is the South Asia Regional Energy Partnership, which we will mobilize in a few months. Through this 5-year activity, USAID will support countries in the region to advance regional energy integration, promote advanced energy technologies, modernize utilities, and promote innovative procurement mechanisms. Together, these 3 mechanisms will support a clean energy transition and decarbonization in South Asia. As a result of all this, today's discussion is very timely. It will provide insights on the existing barriers, opportunities, ideas, and how to move forward on decarbonization in the critical sectors of power, industry, buildings, and transportation in South Asia. I'm looking forward to hearing our distinguished panel members and speakers discuss strategic and regulatory stakes and voluntary actions central to decarbonization tactics. Before I give the floor back to Manali, I would again like to thank these esteemed speakers and all the panel members for being here today and sharing their insights and thoughts with us. I would also like to thank our colleagues from the Hub, as well as from SAGE, who facilitated this event. USAID's commitment to faster and deeper decarbonization in the South Asia region is stronger than ever before, and I hope you will find today's discussions enriching. So with that, I hand the floor back over to you, Manali. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you. So we'll now move on to the next part of the program, which is a presentation by the SAGE team. We have 3 speakers representing each of the labs in the SAGE consortium. The first speaker is David Palchuk, Senior Engineer in the Grid Planning and Analysis Center at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. His work addresses challenges associated with renewable energy integration on the power system. The second speaker is Dr. Shah Yu from PNNL, who is a staff scientist at the Joint Global Change Research Institute. She is an expert in energy and environmental issues, with a focus on decarbonization pathways, energy system transition, climate finance, and smart cities. The final speaker who will be making the presentation today is Dr. Nikita Byankar, scientist in the International Energy Analysis Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He has conducted extensive research and policy analysis on a range of issues, including renewable energy, energy efficiency, electric vehicle, and energy access. So let me just hand it back to the speakers, to the presenters. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Manali. Welcome everyone to the ACEF side event on decarbonization pathways for South Asia. We're excited to be introducing this topic today. Thanks Manali for the introductions and the SAREH team for putting this event together. Okay, so our agenda, what is SAGE? I think that was pretty well covered by Manali and Julia. So I'm gonna quickly go through that and then we're gonna jump right into our main topic, decarbonization. We're gonna split that into 3 sector specific presentations by our different presenters today. So next slide, please. So this is the overall objectives and the mechanisms for activities. I think these were pretty much covered, but we're very excited to be part of SAGE and be collaborating with our colleagues at the other Department of Energy labs, as well as providing access to our South Asia stakeholders to a lot of the expertise that we have within the labs, but as well as our networks in the US and around the globe. Next slide, please. So now on to our main topic, decarbonization. So here you see a simple view of what it means to decarbonize. So this is not really meant to be comprehensive, but I just wanted to give the big picture strategies behind decarbonization before jumping into the more sector specific topics. So starting at the top, energy efficiency. So this might be one of the simpler ways to burn less fossil fuels or produce less carbon. So just simply using less energy through energy efficiency or other means. But you can't really efficiency your way all the way to a fully decarbonized world. You'll still be using energy and burning fuel to do that in conventional sense. So the next really leading ideal globally is to electrify parts of the economy. So instead of burning fuels in cars and to cook and heat buildings, we plug these things in instead. To make this a decarbonized choice though, the grid has to be decarbonized by creating electricity through green, clean sources such as wind or solar, or possibly capturing carbon as it's released through thermal power plants. And this last addition is basically my bucket for everything else that may help South Asia and the rest of the world fully decarbonize. This gets into things like aviation and marine travel, long-term energy storage, etc. I'm not going to talk about that too much today. My colleagues will touch on it, but this is somewhere out there in the future and probably requires a whole other set of webinars, which hopefully we get a chance to do in the future. So through this high level process of outlines, we could reach deep decarbonization and co-benefits like clean air and probably many other benefits. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to jump into decarbonization of the grid. So I want to start with a quick recap of what we know about decarbonization. So likely pathways to a decarbonized energy system include reliance on the grid through electrification, as I just said. So this can mean electrification of cars and buses, industrial processes, etc., being changed from fossil fuel burning processes to running on electricity. But as I said, if for this to be considered decarbonized, the grid is going to need to be producing electricity from clean energy sources. Right now, the leading generation resources transitioning grids to lower carbon are wind and solar and hydro, of course, which has been around for a very long time. Hydro is sometimes considered a more conventional generation source, but nonetheless, it's still growing in parts of South Asia and could be an important piece to this puzzle. The other major change that is on the horizon is a transition to a more distributed energy resources, such as rooftop solar, storage, demand response, electric vehicles, as well as other things. Not only are these solutions leading to clean energy growth, but they also have the potential to shift the supply-demand dynamics. And that dynamic has really shaped the grid as it is today, where generation and transmission is built to meet demand. But this may become more of a two-way street in the future and open the doors to new ideas and potential changes that we might not even be able to predict that well right now. Next slide. So the transformation of the grids in South Asia to higher levels of clean energy is certainly underway. Here I am just highlighting a few initiatives focused on renewable energy growth. So Bangladesh has visions of growing solar substantially over the next several decades. Of course, India is charting an ambitious path for RE growth aiming for 450 gigawatts by 2030. And Nepal, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka all have goals around RE growth. So the bottom line is that RE is likely to play a very big role in the region's decarbonization pathways. And because this transition plays such a critical role in the whole economy decarbonization, it's important that this topic is well understood. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on that specific topic in my next couple slides. So to enable decarbonization, there are many challenges that need to be addressed. Some need to be addressed right now, and some over time as the transition to a low carbon grid continues. So here I'm just highlighting a few that can make the top priority list in terms of things that, if we understood them better, could make the transition easier and more cost effective. So I'm starting with some technical topics here. So on the technical side, number one, I think it's important to understand that the transition to a lower carbon grid, whether fast or slow, will include the existing system assets. And it will be important to consider the continuum of changes that may be needed to maintain system reliability throughout the transition. So here I gave a couple of examples of initiatives that are underway in places in South Asia, particularly India, such as increasing the flexibility of thermal plants. So there are things happening in that regard already, but it's likely that these initiatives can continue to be tweaked and improved and likely tweaked again as the generation mix evolves throughout the course of a year or several years or decades. So I think it's best to continue to try to optimize the use of these existing system assets for a successful transition and continue to weigh trade-offs of how we use these resources. Number two, so resource sharing can help in managing variability and climate change impacts. So big grids are typically more cost effective to operate. And that becomes even more true as you move to a system with more wind and solar, where diversity in resources can help in managing variability. So there are some great potential synergies between countries within the South Asia region to maximize resources and to potentially provide some resiliency against climate change impacts through diversity. Number three, demand is very likely to change in profound ways. So combining sector level planning, even at a very detailed level, may be appropriate as sectors start to lean on one another through electrification. So the distribution network will also be a critical link in this demand evolution. So efforts should be made to combine network planning with large scale grid planning and other sector planning, such as transportation, fleet electrification, and large industries shifting their energy requirements. And number four, reaching a 100% decarbonized grid may not be all RE and hydro. While the transition to a decarbonized grid may be swift, it won't happen overnight. So I think it's good to have a solid framework for continually evaluating various pathways. And that will pay large dividends in ensuring that the pathway somehow meanders toward optimal over time. Next, I just wanted to evaluate some of those same ideas in the context of the policy and regulatory environment. So number one, similar to the technical understanding of how these assets will operate and provide value to the system, the policies and regulations will need to be set up so that these assets are incentivized to do what provides the most value to the grid. The big question dominating this space right now is, how do you incentivize flexibility? A future question could be, how do we value firm capacity in the system with mostly RE, batteries, and hydro? That might require another shift in the regulatory environment to get it right if that ends up being the future. Number two, resource sharing. Coordination between countries will always require some work, but I don't think it's hard to imagine that easier access to resources around the whole region could make a lot of sense. Hydro can help balance variability. Big grids can provide stability for smaller grids. Cheap resources somewhere can help lower the cost in times of stress and other regular operation times. So multilateral cooperation on the policy and regulatory level would be needed to maximize these benefits and provide value for the whole region. Number three, so demand is changing. This topic in particular has a lot of links to the other topics on the slide. But to zero in on that theory, in some places, in practice shows benefits and opportunities, that has shown benefits and opportunities, is demand side acting to balance supply. So if our demand side could be smarter and have access to markets or other mechanisms to be utilized as a balancing resource, the dynamics could substantially shift and show some very cost-effective options for balancing supply and demand. This would likely require new designations for demand-side resources within the existing regulations to be allowed on the grids of South Asia, to be allowed to work within those markets and within those balancing mechanisms. And number 4, so reaching 100% RE. This is, of course, a big change, and I think that the main question is how fast could this happen? If we wanted this to happen on the order of a couple decades, there would need to be very targeted measures taken. And some of these long-term challenges of operating grids at this level might not be completely figured out. So major R&D efforts in that area would also be required to help reach a totally 100% renewable energy grid. So that's the end for me. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Xia Yu, to talk about buildings and industry.
Yep, thank you, David. Hello, everyone. Good morning for people in the US. Good evening for the people in India. So I'm going to cover briefly on decarbonization strategies in buildings and industry. Next one. Yeah. Buildings currently accounts for roughly 40% of final energy consumption in South Asia. And the demand has been growing rapidly in the past 2 decades. In particular, like building electricity demand increased by more than 300% between 2000 and 2018. So with income growth and urbanization, the building energy demand is expected to continue to grow in future in South Asia. One of the critical issues for the region is how to meet increasing service demand while reducing emissions. Next one. So to better understand this issue, we started with reviewing literature published in the past 5 years or so on energy and emission trends in South Asia. The chart here just shows examples of studies on India's building energy sector. We put studies in two different categories based on their level of energy emissions by 2050. So above 4 gigaton of CO2 here indicates that in this studies, India's energy CO2 emissions would continue to grow and getting to more than 4 gigaton of CO2 by 2050. And we didn't further break out the below 4 gigaton category because there are only very few studies there. The blue bar here shows the level of building energy consumption by 2030, and the red bar shows the level of growth in building energy between 2030 and 2050. As you can see here, the level of growth varied significantly across studies. Some studies indicate 70% or more growth, while others show 20% or less growth between 2030 and 2050. But one thing worth noting that none of the studies showing here actually evaluated long-term decarbonization pathway for buildings. We haven't seen enough literature in that category, and something definitely needs enough attention going forward. Some common trends has been identified across the studies, such as transitioning away from traditional biomass as cooking fuel, increasing the efficiency of cooling, lighting, and appliances in buildings, as well as increasing service demand in the backdrop of income growth and urbanization. Next one. What do we need to decarbonize buildings? The first strategy is to maintain sustainable demand growth. So measures like passive design can help curb demand growth. And the second measure has been identified in many literature is to improve energy efficiency. Many South Asian countries already have different building energy efficiency policies and programs in place. And so some further action can be taken to maximize building energy codes, appliance standards and labels, and also to develop incentives for green buildings and retrofits. One thing to note here is that in addition to improve the stringency of policies, it is also important to improve the implementation of policies to make sure that all the policies achieve their design outcome. And as David mentioned, that demand-side electrification is going to be important in the decarbonization world. So for buildings, further increased electrification is one of the critical strategies as well, and moving away from fossil fuels. And finally, as you see higher electrified more and more electrified buildings, it's also important to look into renewable energy integration and further improve renewable energy integration in buildings. And one thing to note here is, like, when we look at decarbonization, we're not only look at energy and environmental systems. So building decarbonization will also bring in additional societal benefits, such as like improving energy access, reducing air pollutant emissions, reducing premature deaths due to improved air quality, and also receiving the same level of services for people, but at lower cost. So there are additional benefits that can be brought in by implementing decarbonization strategy. It's a win-win strategy for the society. Now we're moving to industry. So industry is the largest end-use sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions for the South Asia region. It is also a significant source of air pollutant emissions. Similar to buildings, industry has been growing rapidly in the past decades or so, and industry energy demand in South Asia doubles between 2005 and 2018. And as the backbone of the economy, the overall industry energy consumption is expected to continue to grow rapidly in South Asia in future. There are some unique features for industry, and that also bring in some additional unique challenges. One of the challenges is that industry subsectors are so heterogeneous. So measures that can be used for steel, cement, chemicals, or light manufacturing sectors to decarbonize are all going to be different. So each of the sector requires some unique solutions that bring in additional challenges to decarbonize industry. The other challenge for industry is that industry emissions come from both combustion and process emissions. So both in combustion and process emissions need to be considered when we discuss decarbonization. In terms of energy consumption, in addition to fuel combustion, industry also use significant share of energy at feedstocks. So again, like both fuel combustion fuel and the feedstocks need to be considered in deep decarbonization scenarios we'll look into for industry. Next one. So similar to buildings, we also reviewed existing literature that look into industry transition in South Asia. We found that there are very few studies on industry deep decarbonization, and the majority of studies highlights energy efficiency as a main measure that can be used to decarbonize industry. But to better understand industry decarbonization, we will need better understanding of sector granularity and measures beyond energy efficiency, like such as hydrogen or CCS or biomass. So there are additional efforts need to be taken to study deep decarbonization in industry. One other thing I think is worth noting here is there are strong linkages across different sectors. So industry decarbonization is not only affecting industry alone, it also has interactions with other sectors. Like for example, changing in building floor space or building construction would have implication for steel and cement demand, and that implies for different scales of industry decarbonization. And increasing use of EVs would have an implication for steel and aluminum demand for the industry sector, which also put the decarbonization or scale of industry maybe in a different scale. So increasing electrification in industry would also increase the overall load to the grid. That would have implication on the power sector decarbonization. So what do we need for what do we need to decarbonize industry? So to fully decarbonize industry, we need a comprehensive set of strategies. Starting with energy efficiency that has been already identified by literature across different studies. And we also need a significant set of resource efficiency to help lower demand. But energy efficiency and resource efficiency alone are not sufficient to fully decarbonize industry. The other measures has been commonly identified as electrification, but we can only electrify low temperature heat for industry. There are definitely technical challenges to electrify high temperature heat. So to get remaining emission out of industry or fully decarbonize industry, we also need additional technology measures such as CCS, hydrogen, or biomass used either as fuel or feedstocks. We do need all of above to fully decarbonize industry. Next one. Yeah, so what are potential policy implications in deep decarbonization world, especially for buildings and industry? First of all, I think we need really comprehensive decarbonization policies. As mentioned earlier, there are stronger interactions or linkages across sectors, especially in the decarbonization world. So action in one sector would affect another sector. We do need to consider this kind of sector interactions when designing decarbonization policies. And the other thing to note here is we also need to think beyond CO2 and cover other non-CO2 emissions. In the decarbonization case, it's also important to reduce F-gases like from buildings and industry. And this F-gas reduction requires additional measures than decarbonizing CO2. There are some potential policies to consider. A lot of countries already have energy efficiency measures in place. It is important to continue enhancing and the stringency and implementation of energy efficiency policies. It is also important to improve resource efficiency. So we're looking at a smaller, more efficient scale of the economy to decarbonize. And the third measure is to encourage or design incentives to encourage electrification in both buildings and industry, but also to better understand the implication for the power grid and how this would change the load curve in general. And finally, I think to decarbonize both industry and buildings, especially industry, we need some new technologies such as CCUS and hydrogen. It is important to look into the R&D programs and also potential pilot programs at early stage to decarbonize buildings and industry. One thing, just final thing to note that a lot of infrastructure, buildings and industrial facilities in South Asia are yet to build. So starting on deep decarbonization track today, early enough can help prevent locking into a carbon intensive infrastructure and reducing risk of stranded assets. So with that, I'm going to turn to Niket on transportation sector.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Shah and David. So I'm briefly going to be talking about the decarbonization opportunities in the transportation sector. Next, please. Before I do that, I'm just going to tell you three numbers, okay? 20, 500, and 900. So 20 are the number of cars owned per 1,000 people in India, and that is true for most of the South Asian countries. Bangladesh is approximately 5 cars per 1,000 people. Sri Lanka is approximately 6 or 7 cars per 1,000 people. So that number is pretty similar. So 20. The next number is 500, which are the cars owned per 1,000 people by Germany or Japan, the countries with some of the most advanced intercity and within city public transport infrastructure. And US that has about 900 cars per 1,000 people. I think the limited point is no matter which development model India or other South Asian countries choose to go from 20 cars per 1,000 people to 500 or 900 cars per 1,000 people, that's an order of magnitude change and a massive pent-up demand that is really about to come over the next 20 to 30 years. Interestingly, what has happened, this is also the time when several clean energy technologies have become more and more cost effective, and several decarbonization pathways exist as the transport demand builds in the South Asian region. There are modal shift opportunities, both for freight as well as passenger transport, but usually the time constant on those like public rail systems and metros and so on is generally very long, 20 to 30 years or so. There are standard technology options in terms of enhancing the IC engine efficiency, fuel switching from diesel or gasoline to CNG, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, given the scale at which the demand is going to grow, it may not move the needle much when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. It may help for the local air quality and local air pollution, but not as much for the greenhouse gas emission reduction. There are hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles, particularly heavy duty vehicles. However, there is a problem of high cost and challenging infrastructure build out, especially for hydrogen refueling, hydrogen storage, and so on. And finally, there are electric vehicles, and which is what I'm going to focus on this talk. And the cost effectiveness of electric vehicles has increased significantly over the last few years, mainly because of the changes in the battery technology. Next, please. So the chart on the left shows how rapidly the battery pack prices have fallen just over the last 5 to 6 years. So just in the last 5 years, since 2015, the battery pack, lithium-ion battery pack prices have fallen by nearly 70 to 80%. And you are pretty well aware of those numbers. And that trend is continued to go on into the future. But what is really unprecedented are two things. Number one is, in addition to the cost reduction, just the battery technology in terms of energy density, the specific energy, the fast charging capability has advanced significantly. So that has an impact on what kind of electric vehicles are available on the market. So longer range electric vehicle, fast charging capable electric vehicles, so a car that can be charged in 30 minutes or even state of the art in 20 minutes is really being offered as one of the standard vehicles onto the market, and that changes which other gasoline or diesel cars these can replace. And the other big change is the industry has always beaten all the price forecasts made by experts, and that includes everybody. So the several studies just conducted 3 to 4 years ago expected the battery pack price to go to $120, $130 per kilowatt hour in 2030 or even mid 2030s. The battery prices have already reached that level, $120 to $130 per kilowatt hour in 2020. So there is a 10-year kind of lag in terms of what the studies typically present and what the industry has already achieved. And not surprisingly, as a result, major OEMs, Volvo, GM, Ford, several European auto manufacturers are committing to 100% new EV sales, and not just in the passenger car segment, but also in the heavy duty truck segment. And major key economies have also aggressively expanding the EV deployment and infrastructure build out. I'm sure you're pretty well aware of the EV sales, which is what the chart on the right shows in US, European Union, China. China recently sold close to 1 million EVs just in the last year. But what is interesting is also the investment in the public charging infrastructure that these economies are doing. China, for example, just in the year 2020, built nearly 300,000 public charging stations in 1 year, and they expect to continue on the same trajectory into the future. So things are really changing, and that has a deep implication on some of the South Asian economies, particularly India, which has a very strong auto industry and also has significant exports. So if the rest of the world is changing and auto industry in the rest of the world has really been advancing to electric vehicles, the auto industry in India cannot be a laggard. Otherwise, it's a major global competitiveness issue. Next, please. Now, one of the common criticisms of electric vehicles is they have high upfront cost, and that is true. But what is interesting, if you look at the total cost of ownership on dollars per mile or dollars per kilometers traveled, the electric vehicles for most vehicle segments are already cheaper. And what I've shown on this chart is an example of a truck, a 25-ton ton electric truck in India. And one of the reasons why I've chosen the truck example is an electric car getting cheaper story is generally pretty well known. And the upfront cost barrier in the electric car segment or even electric two-wheeler segment, which is more relevant for South Asia, is generally well known. But what is not well known is what is really happening with trucks. And the reason trucks are important, particularly in the South Asia region, is nearly 60 to 70% of all the oil consumption that happens in the transport sector happens in the heavy duty vehicle segment in most of the South Asian economies. And these heavy duty vehicles, particularly trucks and buses, are also responsible for over 60% of the local air pollution in many urban cities in the South Asian region. So that's why targeting this heavy duty vehicle segment is also critical from the greenhouse gas emissions perspective, from fuel imports perspective, and also from the local air quality perspective. So getting back to the 25-ton truck, which is the most popular truck size in the South Asian region. The electric truck is more expensive on an upfront cost basis than a comparable diesel truck, which is shown in the left-hand side chart. But if you just look at the total cost of ownership in dollars per kilometer, then the electric truck is actually cheaper to own and operate than a diesel truck, which is shown on the right-hand side. And it is significantly cheaper, so much so that the payback period is less than 3 years or so. Now, the second common criticism is, well, the electric trucks have batteries, and the batteries are significantly heavy. And as a result, for freight transport or even for passenger transport, the battery weight impact is pretty significant. That is only partially true. Batteries are heavier, but in an electric vehicle, particularly electric truck, you also do not have any engine or transmission or any kind of diesel drivetrain. So that also reduces the weight significantly. There is an additional weight of an electric vehicle truck, typically 5 to 10% extra relative to a diesel equivalent, but that does not necessarily change the payload implications, because more recent trend, because of the hub and spoke delivery model of most of the freight transport, many trucks are hitting the volume constraint and not necessarily the payload constraint. And that's why, as a result, even if there is a 5-10% impact on payload, it does not necessarily impact the overall freight costs. Next, please. But the next question is, what about the additional electricity demand due to electrification? I'm talking particularly about transport electrification. What we found is, given that the electricity demand in the region is growing pretty rapidly, between 6 to 7% per year, the additional electricity demand due to electrification of vehicles seems to be somewhat modest. So what this chart shows is the total electricity demand with and without electrified end uses, transport, buildings, as well as some part of industry for India up to 2020, which is actual, and beyond 2020 are projections if we really go on this aggressive electrification strategy. What we find is that additional electricity load seems to be modest relative to the electricity load that is growing already. But on the flip side, there are significant macroeconomic benefits. So 80 to 90% of the oil that gets consumed in the South Asian region, and including India, is imported. So there are significant energy security benefits. Now, one can always argue, well, the batteries are also imported, so how is that really energy security benefit? But there's a fundamental difference in importing a capital asset like a battery and a consumptive good like oil. And that's why that changes the trade balance benefits as well. Now, the second important benefits is inflation-proof, low-cost freight transport. So fluctuations in diesel prices changes the freight transport, and that is a major contributor to the overall consumer inflation. With fixed freight transport costs from electric vehicles, the consumer inflation also potentially gets controlled. I've already talked about the global competitiveness of the domestic auto industry, especially if the other economies have already advancing. And last but not the least, its significant benefits of in terms of public health because of reduced local air pollution, avoiding over 200,000 premature deaths. Obviously, all of this is not going to happen on its own. Significant policy support will be required. So I've just given some broad contours of what policy support may be needed. First is some level of procurement, sales, or fleet level mandates to include electric vehicles into the mix. That could be a ZEV mandate, zero emission vehicle mandate. That could be aggressive revision of the CAFE-like standards. The other is to address the upfront cost barriers, some level of incentives, rebates, or low-cost financing. Charging infrastructure build-out is absolutely crucial, and this is where the role of government or utilities or any public agency becomes crucial, and it's a classic chicken and egg problem. Charging infrastructure first or EVs first, but charging infrastructure needs significant policy as well as financial support. Reforming electricity prices could be demand charges, time of use, or real-time pricing, long-term low-cost PPAs or fixed-cost PPAs with renewable energy or solar or wind projects that really changes the economics of electric vehicles even further. And lastly, incentivize domestic manufacturing. It could be the production-linked incentives, it could be tradable domestic content requirement, or there could be several other possibilities as well. But domestic manufacturing becomes crucial given the importance of auto sector and given some of the energy security concerns. So let me just stop here and thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Nikit, David, and Shah, for an excellent presentation. We now move on to, we'll take the questions later on at the end, but we'll now move on to the panel discussion. We have a very illustrious panel members with us. I'll quickly introduce them. Our chair for the evening today is Dr. Kirit Parikh, who is the chairman of the Integrated Research and Action for Development, or IRADE. He was the member of the Planning Commission in charge of energy and a member of the Economic Advisory Council of Prime Minister of India. Dr. Parikh was honored with Padma Bhushan, the third highest civilian award in Republic of India, and he has held several key positions. So I'm not going to go through them, but we are really delighted to have Dr. Parikh. I'll also quickly introduce our other 5 panel members before I hand it over to Dr. Parikh. So we have Dr. Rakesh Sarwal, a senior Indian Administrative Service officer with a medical degree and a doctorate degree in public health from Johns Hopkins University, US. As an additional secretary in Niti Aayog, he handles the energy portfolio covering policy-related matter of all the energy ministries. We have with us also Mr. Sulakshana Jayawardene, the Director General of Sri Lanka Sustainable Energy Authority. He is a Sri Lanka Administrative Service Officer with over 17 years of experience in the power sector of Sri Lanka. Representing think tanks, we have Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, an economist who leads CEW, Council of Energy, Environment and Water, work on low carbon pathways. His research focuses on energy and climate change mitigation policy issues, especially those impacting India. Representing the private sector, we have Mr. Joe Phelan, India Director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, a global CEO-led organization of over 200 leading business working together to accelerate the transition to a sustainable world with actions in energy, water, electric mobility, and so on. And our last panelist for today is representing Bangladesh private sector is Mr. Muhammad Akhtar Hussain Apurbo, Director of the Bangladesh Knitwear Manufacturer Exporters Association. He has several years of experiences in ready-made garments in Bangladesh and a vast experience working as the socioeconomic researchers as well. So I'll pass it now on to Dr. Parikh. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Monali. I think we are quite delayed in many cases. The NRE fellows took much more time when presentation, but I hope all of you would be a little more disciplined in your presentation. I think we have to realize that decarbonization is really important. those South Asian countries feel often that they are the least responsible for climate change, and they're some of the most vulnerable ones. Still, it is in our interest that the world goes as rapidly as possible to a decarbonization stage. I think one has to really understand what are our responsibilities, what are our, in some sense, and rights to the global environment. And I think there are a number of issues that we can discuss. One is the technology availability. All these new technologies, this rapid fall in some battery technology, etc. At what cost and at what level, and how efficient, if easily it would be available, is a big question. Even though some of that these may be considered as a global public goods, we have seen that even the global public good of vaccines for corona are not easily transferred and available to developing countries. So I think we need to look at that issue. I think transition involves also many risks on the way. The path is, for example, the employment impact. So if India goes from coal to renewables, on the coal sector, there will be significant employment reduction. Redeployment of the same people would be difficult because it requires a different kind of skills and would be required at different level and different geographical distribution of new employment that will be created. I think another issue that might be of importance for countries like India would be stranded assets. All the investment that have been made in the coal-based power plant, for example, even when they start operating it, it's at 55% compared to 80% load factor. There is a loss in their value, their assets, and some of them may not be able to serve the loans that they have received, and stranded assets become a problem. And it might even throw a burden on the bank sector, which then becomes very, very difficult to get credit for other important investments as well. So I think we have to consider these issues as well, but there are also many opportunities. We should certainly aim for human development in an inclusive way. We can have an inclusive and low carbon strategy development. We have opportunities for regional cooperation that can reduce our emissions. But in all this, we have to recognize where we can really go from in this area and what we should be able to do. I will begin to ask questions to individual things and a very specific question to each one of them in the first round, and then can go to another round and then some public question and answer position. So let me first raise a question to Dr. Rakesh Sarwal of the Niti Aayog. And the main question there is, as I said, what technological breakthroughs does Niti Aayog consider as vital and critical for Indian economy? And how do you think we will have access to it? And what kind of measures are we taking even to develop some of these technologies ourselves? Dr. Sarwal.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Parikh. I think you have asked a very pertinent question, and that's along with the funding, concessional funding, are the two key issues that developing countries, particularly India and South Asia, are facing in order to meet their Paris carbon reduction targets. And here I would start by saying that India has been ranked the only country, the top country in the 2020 Climate Transparency Report of the G20 countries, which is meeting India's Paris commitments. So that just goes on to show that Indian government is totally committed, has taken a huge number of steps to meet the greenhouse gas emission targets, India's commitments, and reduce the carbon emissions, both for its international commitments as well as for the health of our people and the growth of our economy, the points that you mentioned. So talking particularly of the technological aspect, I think you summed it up beautifully by saying it should be considered as a global public good. And it would take a long time for any country to develop these technologies on its own. So what our country has done is the productivity-linked incentive scheme. And of the 10 components of this, I think four relate to the energy sector. So it is wafer and solar cells manufacturing. It is battery. It relates to light, the white goods, as well as it also relates to the steel. So the productivity link says that you manufacturing component, bring in the technology, and gradually you take the incentives of the sales that you generate in the country. So I think that's the flagship program of the government to promote technology. But notwithstanding that, I think the central point for this conference would be that how soon and how easily can the developing countries, and particularly the high energy consuming countries like India, be provided technology as a public good, the one that you mentioned. And I think that will hold the key to our ability as a nation, as a community of the world, to achieve the targets that we have jointly set together for ourselves. So that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, certainly particularly for remaining in time. May I now request Sri Jayawardena to say, look at what particular sectors that Sri Lanka is concentrating its effort on, and that where we need further policy and financing support, and what can we learn from it?
Thank you, Dr. Parikh. Yeah, before moving to answer the question, I would like to share some of the basic information about energy requirement. If you consider about the total energy demand is approximately 415 petajoule. There are three main key areas that energy utilized. Those are household sector, then industrial sector, and also transport sector. These three sectors, they utilize approximately one-third of each, one-third of total energy demand. So in that context, when it comes to the household and commercial sector, electricity is approximately one-third of total demand. So basically, as a country, we have focused electricity sector, and most of the initiatives have been introduced to achieve decarbonization targets, because under the Paris Agreement, we have pledged to the international community to reduce 5% of carbon emission from our business as usual scenario. So there are certain targets and certain objectives that we have to meet during the period of 2020 to 2030. Now, so under that, we basically focus to introduce more and more renewables, and the government has decided to achieve the target of 70% of electricity demand from clean sources, including LNG. So when it comes to the renewable sector, of course, the initiatives have been introduced to absorb more renewables to the system in terms of electricity generation. So we have introduced solar rooftop program, and now there are more than 370 megawatt of solar systems, and also utility scale solar systems, and also wind. Very recently, we commissioned 100 megawatt of wind power plant. likewise, we are moving towards decarbonization because there is a target to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. So that is declared in the National Energy Policy, which was announced in 2019. And also we do have some constraint in terms of renewable energy absorption, because we have not connected, though some of the studies have been taken place to connect our system to Indian network, but still it has not been finalized. So there are certain technical constraints in terms of renewable energy, because solar, of course, the battery technology or the storage technologies still evolving. So we have not introduced a battery or any other storage technology to Sri Lankan power system. And also now we are looking to introduce do the feasibility studies to have a pump storage project, because there are some reservoirs and tanks we can utilize to have a pump storage project. The feasibility study will be commenced probably within this year. So likewise, we are moving towards decarbonization process, and also there is an effort to introduce LNG operations to the system in terms of power generation. So very recently, we floated tender to introduce LNG infrastructure facility. It is still on, and also we yet to sign or we about to sign power purchase agreement for 300 megawatt of LNG power plant. Likewise, there are certain initiatives that we have introduced to bring our power sector into clean and to move towards decarbonization stage. For the time being, I think I have answered your question. Next round, I will explain more and more what are the sectors that we have to focus further to achieve decarbonization targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jayawardena. May I now request Vaibhav Chaturvedi, who has been working a lot in this area, to say in what sense you think are the major achievements of India in this area, and what further policies in finance, etc., will need to overcome the barrier and speed up these achievements. Vaibhav.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Parikh, and thank you, USAID, for inviting me for this very interesting discussion. So, in terms of the key achievements of the government, it's very clear. It's renewable energy is the sort of big thing that the government of India is working on, and the targets are indeed very ambitious. And there are other things also, like increase in energy efficiency, both in the residential sector, in the industrial sector. So all those things are very good, and there could be many things that could be listed in terms of the efforts that are being made. But clearly, what stands out in terms of ambition and in terms of demonstrating climate leadership is this massive target of renewable energy. Now, having said that, even the 475 gigawatt target that the government of India has put for 2030, which is very ambitious, but is still a sort of an intermediate target, in the sense if we look at the longer term decarbonization, like the 2050 story. And what will really matter is the extent of targets that the government ultimately takes in terms of the longer term strategy. For NDC, the target is, let's say, a reduction of 33-35% of emission intensity. For 2050, it all depends what will be the target. The target is 60%, or whether the target is 80%, or whether it is on pathway to net zero for some even future year like 2070. That target will determine the demand for and will tell us that what are the real impediments, because slow pace of increase is always much more doable than the sort of transformatory pace of increase that is required for achieving a much more ambitious kind of low carbon future. And that is where finance is something that is clearly that sort of stands out. In the sense that the requirement for low cost finance is huge in India. Even now, the solar projects that are being financed in India have around anywhere between 13 to 16% cost of capital, as compared to a coal power plant, which is much more lower. And it's only because coal as an industry has been standing there for a long time, Whereas solar is comparatively, even though it has advanced at a very fast pace, comparatively it is a newer sector. And what we are seeing in many states, that cancellation of PPAs by the state governments and many other the sort of unnecessary things, as we say, which are happening, which are only sort of increasing the risk perception for this sort of new age sector, which leads to this higher cost of capital. Clearly it's an impediment for India, and the solution is, there are two parts of the solution. One is clearly anything that that scares the investor, anything like cancellation of PPA, anything like that, which are very obvious from business perspective that should not be done. So these are very obvious things, but they are still happening. So those the obvious illogical things should definitely not happen. No scaring investors is the last thing that that any stakeholder should be trying to do. So that is first thing. But even if you don't actually I mean, if even if everything is very sort of positive in terms of the legality, the contractual formalities of the setup of the Indian renewable energy setup, is still what we see very clearly is that finance, and low cost finance especially, is moving in what we know as the sort of the the developed country block. So the low cost finance is sort of moving between these countries, and all the emerging economies, be it India or be it countries in Africa or South Asian or South American nations, where the biggest potential for growth of many of these renewable technologies there, they are still facing a big finance challenge, not in just in terms of quantum of finance. I think there are many investors that are ready to invest. So the quantum, so to speak, doesn't matter. It's the cost of finance that matters. And low cost finance is not what India is getting. And that's why some very innovative sort of things, be it at the platform like International Solar Alliance, where they're thinking about innovative risk mitigation kind of products, or any other bilateral or multilateral initiatives, which ultimately attacks this element of the cost of finance, is going to be extremely important for India to achieve much more ambitious future. It is already ambitious, but to go even beyond that, low cost finance is clearly there. And second, to just close my initial statement, the second thing is about technology co-development. As Dr. Parikh, you have also mentioned, many technologies are developed. So when we see these presentations, clearly at the tech front, we are already breaching the barriers. But whether these technologies are being co-developed or not is a big question. Still, the patent issues are always there, and these are the challenges in developing countries we always continue to face. And unless we are able to tide over these through either co-innovation, co-development, or anything, we will continue to face these challenges. So those two things, technology co-development and low cost of finance, are the big things that India needs to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaibhav. May I now request Mr. Phelan to give us the perspective from industries. How do industries look at this whole business of low carbon development or decarbonization?
Thank you, Dr. Parikh, and thanks to USAID for organising this event. And it's a pleasure to be on the call, not only with colleagues from India, but also with participants from Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So I work for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and as mentioned, we're 200 large companies who are looking at the transition to a sustainable world as an opportunity. They're committed together to succeed by better managing risk, by being more resilient, and by leading in capturing the new opportunities there are in accelerating the transition to a more sustainable world. One of the membership criteria of the World Business Council is that our members commit to net zero by 2050 with a credible roadmap to achieve it. The way that companies use the World Business Council to seize those opportunities and manage risk is that they work together, often across value chains, to raise the common level of understanding of what's commercially viable today in terms of different application and deployment of technologies and business models, so that they can accelerate deployment, generate more demand, and give very, very strong market signals. So the first piece is about understanding what's commercially viable today, and the second piece is together to understand what technologies and regulations are coming, so that they can both plan investments and plan their long-term strategies, but also where necessary, they can advocate for policies that will drive more sustainable business. And I just want to give two brief examples of collective action by business in India, one in the space of energy and one in the space of electric vehicles. So our RE Scale project is accelerating the corporate procurement of renewable energy globally and in key markets around the world, including in India. And more than 25% of all the renewable energy power purchase agreements signed by companies has been signed by WBCSD member companies. And in India, we've seen the success of the renewable energy market there. Companies are taking a lead in setting ambitions for themselves, but also taking a lead in technology adoption as well. And India is the focus for a new project led by companies based in India on energy storage, again, mobilizing the value chain for energy storage to accelerate deployment. Coming to electric vehicles, as Nikit Abhyankar said earlier at this webinar, this decade is crucial for India's electrification ambition. Vehicle ownership in India is low and much of the procurement is yet to happen. And a slow transition to electric vehicles in this decade would mean tens of millions of petrol and diesel vehicles on Indian roads for the next 10 to 15 years. There was a comment in the chat earlier from Anjana Das, where the comparison was made to government procurement leading the transition to LEDs with light bulbs. But electric vehicles, it was pointed out, are much more expensive than electric light bulbs. And so the bridge from government procurement to mass adoption is needed. And the answer for electric, whereas government procurement could drive that transition with light bulbs, you need a bridge with electric vehicles. And the answer is corporate fleets. And so the second program that I want to share with you is WBCSD's RE Mobility project. And this is engaging more than 50 companies from the electric vehicle ecosystem in India to accelerate commercial fleet electric vehicle adoption in India. Companies include a lot of American companies, actually, like Uber, American Express, Walmart, Google, Accenture, and so on. Together, these 50 plus companies represent 10 billion kilometers of annual mobility demand, of which 250 kilometers of their annual mobility demand have now been electrified through their own actions across ride hailing, deliveries, and employee transport. And as well as working together to accelerate their own adoption of electric vehicles, they've also made available some knowledge products. So there's an India Business Guide to EV adoption to help champions within companies accelerate their own journey to electric fleets. I'm going to stop here because I'm aware of time constraints, but I look forward to any further questions.
Thank you very much. I have another question to you, Mr. Fellon. You know, these large firms and large companies can certainly go, and there are many of them are showing this enthusiasm for decarbonization. They also feel perhaps that this gives them a public relations advantage over others. But in India, a large part of manufacturing is done by small firms, small and medium enterprises. How do you see their involvement in whole decarbonization strategy? Or does your organization worry about them at all?
Sure. So, I mean, what's driven most decarbonization for industry has been the cost effectiveness of new technologies, and renewables now stand on their own as competitive with other power sources, and storage can then help with firm power. So, I think the three things that will drive this transition through smaller enterprises, which is crucial in South Asia. First, the cost of technology. Second, strong linkages with bigger companies who also need to disclose the carbon footprint of their supply chain. And lastly, supportive policies from government, shifting from penalizing or taxing good things to taxing bad things. So shifting incentives that can then flow through the economic system. So small businesses will respond very well to those.
May I now request Akhtar Hussain Apurba, and he has actually will be similar question that I asked you just now is also addressed to him, because he has a very many small, I hope, knitwear manufacturers, exporters are there. And how are they dealing with this whole idea of decarbonization? Do they think this as a burden, as an opportunity, a challenge, or what?
Thank you, Mr. Parikh. It's a great pleasure for me to representing BKMA here in this panel. Actually, I would like to say why this decarbonization is very important for our livelihood, actually for our future. But for BKMA, the members, we are the association for around 2,000 small and medium enterprises also. So we have some strategies or the operations for our member organizations or member industries. They consider the decarbonizations. If they consider, then what would be the benefit? They knows that one. But the major concern is the investment here. I can tell you some real life experience that we have in Bangladesh in our own factories and our member factories. There is in Bangladesh now, you know, the USGBC green factories, the lead green factories. Now in Bangladesh, almost more than 200 factories are green certified. Around 500 factories we have already on process of getting the USGBC green certifications. But what are the advantages? Why these industries are getting the certification? The advantage actually is the latest technologies that reduces the energy uses. When the energy uses are reducing, the cost of operation, cost of production is reducing, which ultimately make the industry more competitive. So this is the one major issue. Another one is the safe and healthier working environment that actually improve our healthy environment for the workers. Ultimately, the workers' productivity increase. So it also promotes the competitiveness. And I can tell you few tools that actually we in RMG sectors in Bangladesh we are using to reduce the carbon productions and decarbonization, contribute in decarbonizations. First of all, we are using the installations of water meter. You know, the RMG industry is hugely concentrated on, especially the dyeing sector, on water, uses of water in dyeing. So when we are using the water meter, so it can easily tell the producers that how much water you are using. Is it overuses or not? If overuse, then we can cut off the water uses, and which ultimately reduce the uses of energy. So cost also savings here. In ETP, effluent treatment plant we are using for the dyeing sections. These also, you know, the water we are using for dyeing that actually contaminated with dyes and chemicals. So we refine the water. Most of the water, sir, we are using from ground level. So groundwater reusing, we are reusing most of the water again for dyeing and other purposes, which actually reduce the uses of water and reduces the energy use. And in factory level also, we are using a lot of energy savings methods, like instead of LED lights, the CFL lights, we are using the LED, which reduces the energy uses. Also, we are using the converter. We are using solar energy to reduce the energy that the human fossil fuel. We are using fossil fuel to produce the electricity, so it reduces. And a lot of things we are using here to get help contribute in the economy in decarbonization. But the thing is to use these technologies. Most of the micro, small, and medium enterprises doesn't have the capacity to invest. It needs a lots of investment here. So this is actually our challenge in this industry. So we are facing now financial problem. Government, there is some opportunities also. Government from the central bank, they have introduced some fund here for green factory establishment. If you want, then you will get some cheap cost fund here. But this the process of getting the fund is too long, so people actually discouraged to get this one. And also most of the big industries, they have the accessibility, but major industries are small and medium, they are not getting this finance. So this is actually our challenges. If we can get the easy access to finance, cheap cost financing, and as well as the technologies with lower cost, because lots of things we need to import, but there is some import duties on top of these items that actually discourages us to invest in more eco-friendly and environment-friendly technologies to use. So government should consider these issues also. And once we will get this, I think BKMEA or BGMA or whatever the two trade bodies here, this is actually our major sector of total foreign earning. Around 83% of our Bangladesh foreign earnings coming from this industry. So this industry can contribute in national economy, national environment to reduce the carbon footprint.
Thank you, Mr. Apurva. And I think we can go to the next set. I understand that getting money from any such government organization is extremely expensive for small and medium enterprises.
They don't have any access actually. They don't have the linkage, to get the financial.
It may be available on paper, but in practice, it's very difficult to access.
That's true. That's true.
May I now ask another set of questions to Sri Rakesh Sarwal as to how do you see the role of regional cooperation in accelerated decarbonization? Do you see that?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Parikh. While it is an extremely important question and it does open opportunities, but I would still like to emphasize the role of the developed countries in helping us with both the technology and low-cost fund that my colleague Vaibhav mentioned. And none of these two things, technology or low-cost capital, is something that the countries in our neighborhood or with our level of development have. So notwithstanding the principal point of accessing technology and low-cost finance, which should be a public good, as you rightly mentioned, there are a lot of things that India is doing as a country in order to foster collaboration with fellow countries. I would list some of them. Like for climate finance, NEEF fund was conceived with other countries, and with Mr. David Cameron, the British Prime Minister at that time. This was conceived by our Honorable Prime Minister. All these examples can then include countries in the region to finance our clean transition. Then climate change adaptation strategies for cooling action plan, something India has done. We could share that with other countries and develop a similar plan. And Kagli agreement for energy efficient cooling is another example. International Solar Alliance is something that India has taken the lead, where other regional countries are also involved. And climate disaster risk reduction, the coalition for disaster resilience infrastructure is something that India has taken the lead, where the other countries are and can also be involved. India has also committed desertification, to reverse desertification by planting forest in a record amounts of degraded land. Recently, Prime Minister reiterated that target is another area. So India can share those targets and those efforts and experiences with regional countries. Besides that, I think our Sri Lankan colleague did mention about grid, limited grid connectivity in the region. And that's one area. I think if the grids are efficient, the losses can be collectively reduced, the energy transfer is smooth. That is one area in which we can collaborate. And of course, sharing of technology, sharing of low-cost finance, a regional approach in that will really help. So that's all for now, Dr. Parikh.
Thank you very much. I think, as you probably know, that India is already trading electricity with Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. And I think we have at our institute rather done a study which shows really that power exchange, because of the complementarity of the resources bases of different states and so on, can be extremely beneficial to all the countries. And that not only just in terms of reducing their emissions, but also promoting their growth and economic development. But let me go and ask this question now to Sri Jayawardena, that how does he see cooperation in other countries can be, I mean, India and Nepal India and Sri Lanka can easily trade electricity if we can overcome the small problem that we have of undersea or oversea transmission link.
Thank you. Very good question and challenging question to answer, because now one thing is we do have huge potential of renewables, where we can, if we can develop those potential, we can get maximum or we can meet maximum demand from renewable energy. For instance, now, if you consider about the solar potential, it is enormous. I mean, there are certain other constraints like land constraints and some other social issues are there, but still the developable potential is huge. So one of the key issue that we are facing is intermittence, and also our system is comparatively small one. So if we can connect to the India, of course, we can generate more and more renewables or more and more electricity from renewable sources. And also now we are doing some studies with World Bank consultants to have offshore wind power plants. Now, the offshore wind power plant capacity also huge. So we can develop this renewable energy capacities if we can connect to the India, because then we can evacuate the power and we can get the power when we required, and something like that electricity transaction can be done. And as you very correctly mentioned, one of the key challenges is the cost, because the studies were conducted somewhere in, 2010 or 2012. The cost is significantly high because of the line length of the submarine cable. So these are the challenge that we are facing, and we have to overcome this kind of challenges with the assistance from other countries and also other lending agencies or donor agencies. Because if we can have the interconnection, of course, we can generate more renewables and we can add more renewables to the system. Potential is there.
Thank you very much. Let me ask to all the panelists in general to answer a question that I should have asked, but I didn't ask to them. So if they want to make any comment on any of this missing question, you are most welcome. Vaibhav, would you like to say something, or?
Sure. I wanted to touch base on the international cooperation thing, Dr. Parikh, in a very different way. I mean, we know about, as Dr. Sarwal has already talked about, the many things that India is already doing. In many things, the framing is always that we are looking towards the developed world for, let's say, access to technology, access to finance and all. Now, that is one particular framing. Now, can we really flip the framing, and can we say that are there some things for which the world, or at least the emerging economies, is looking towards India? And there is one thing that is very clear to us, and Dr. Sarwal mentioned about the India Cooling Action Plan, and CW has been heavily involved in the formulation of the ICAP. We are particularly leading the servicing segment of it, which is the face of it, and this is something that is very common to all the emerging economies, including India. And that sort of, I learned this whenever I went to the Montreal Protocol meetings and wherever we presented our work there at the UN platform. And the response I could see from all the African economies, many South Asian economies, and many Latin American economies, essentially every country that is sort of emerging economy in the same space as India. And if you look at the air conditioning servicing sector, it is a hugely informal sector. Even in India, we see like we say 90% of the AAC servicing technician are in the informal sector, which is like who are like semi-trained. And so that is one thing. And that is something very common across all of these countries, and that is why we were getting so much questions from many of the representatives of these countries. In ICAP, we have already talked about how do we really formalize this sector, because formalization is something extremely important. And formalization would mean we have a sort of a certification system for training, so that we are able to differentiate between a good technician versus a not so good technician. So creation of certification, creation of formalized training modules, and creation of many different things like databases and internet of sort of things, many interventions that India is already planning, where there's a great scope for international cooperation, because it has a huge implication for energy efficiency. Just I want to conclude with this point. If you look at India's energy efficiency policy in the residential sector, almost all of it is focused on higher penetration of, let's say, high efficiency appliances, let's say 5-star ACs. And what is very clear to us, and this is what the industry guys tell us, that even if you have a 5-star AC, but you don't install it properly and you don't operate it properly, that 5-star AC actually gives us a efficiency of a 3-star AC. And similarly, a 3-star AC gives us the efficiency of a 1-star AC, just because of installation and operation is not in the right way. So it's a minefield for us to enhance energy efficiency, not through pushing energy efficient equipment, but by pushing the behavior change or servicing kind of practices of people, and which is there. And this sort of setup is common across many emerging economies. India is sort of leading the way, and I see a clear, great role for cooperation in which India can also share these learnings with many other economies and actually achieve much higher levels of residential or commercial energy efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaibhav, for raising a very. Anybody else wants to make any comments? Well, in that case, I think let us just go to the questions. One of the questions is about pump storage. What is India doing on pump storage? We already about 6,000 megawatt of pump storage already installed or under construction, about to become commissioned, and another 6,000 under various kinds of schemes are there. But we also at IRADE studied the possibilities of non-river connected independent small storage schemes, hydro schemes, pump storage schemes, which can be set up very quickly and put up very quickly all over the country, and can really help you provide peaking power and balancing power, etc. So let me, the questioner wants it directed to David, so I will ask David to add anything he wants to do to this. David?
Thank you, Dr. Parikh. So yeah, I tried to answer part of the question in the chat, but I'm not sure I got the numbers right, actually. Just getting those sent to me. But yeah, I guess I would say that, NREL's looking a little bit at energy storage for the region. I think the biggest challenge is probably cost competitiveness with the alternatives, which, batteries, as Nick had showed in his presentation, the prices are dropping dramatically. So what we found is that it would probably take some pretty aggressive measures to incentivize pump storage. I not making a call on whether that's the right thing to do for India or the region. I think it certainly could be an indigenous resource, but certainly it's going to have challenges if utilities and others are making the choice between the flexibility you get from batteries and the flexibility you get from pump storage. Batteries are really looking attractive. So I think that would be the main challenge for pump storage in the region.
Yeah, there is another question I think about which I'm not able to read here, but wait a second. Yeah, I can read it now.
The questions are also projected on the screen, Dr. Parikh.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see where.
Should I read it out for you?
Yeah, no, I think there is another question about carbon capture and utilization. And the questioner wants to know what is NITI Aayog doing about CCUS. So, Dr. Sarwal, would you like to say something on this?
Yeah, Dr. Parikh, I think it's a priority area. And given the present level of technology availability, it is still at a trial stage, and it is a focus area certainly, and there's no doubt that it has to be promoted. And I would say that the greening campaign, which I just mentioned, forestation in degraded lands, is a biocarbon storage actually, and that has multiple benefits, both in terms of environment, climate, livelihood, and in terms of water, conservation of water. So that is also something that is committed by India at the highest level. That's all for now.
At the regulatory level, what kind of storage facilitation that we are doing, or CERC has it said anything on this or not? And does anyone know about these things?
I could take this.
Yeah.
So there was a recent announcement by the CERC under their ancillary services announcement regulations that they've drafted ancillary services market regulations, which will allow for energy storage and demand response resources to participate. So they're still at the draft stage. They're accepting feedback until the end of this month. But if adopted, that would certainly have a lot of potential to accelerate renewable share of the grid. And that's a very positive development.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have perhaps dealt with all the other questions. If anything is missing, Monali, could you bring it to my notice? I thought I've covered all of the questions, but
sure.
Otherwise, let us. Huh?
Sure. So there was, one or two questions, which was general questions, which is the new technology for industry sector are either readily available or at a very high cost. So what are the policy insights for the South Asian country, and are we moving in the right direction?
Yeah, thank you, Monali. So, I mean, generally speaking, well, I hope that you are moving in the right direction. See, the right direction is probably more than the discovery of technologies. The right direction can be measured more in terms of the policy, directions. That is the policy direction very clear in front of us, and then technologies will evolve. Business models will evolve for us to take in that direction, and from that perspective, as I'm seeing at least the net zero debate, which is another different debate. We are not going to talk about the net zero debate here, but CW has done a lot of work even for that, informing that debate. It's very clear that at least many countries around the world have shown an inclination for a very stringent target. in the sense net zero is a sort of a specific formulation of the deep decarbonization debate that we are talking about here. So it's a very specific formulation, and that's why it is sort of very uncomfortable, because deep decarbonization could be defined in many, many different ways. Net zero is something which is much harder. There's no other sort of alternative definitions, alternative meanings to it in practice. So as many countries are taking very hard choices, which is the policy direction. And the expectation is that if these hard policy choices are being made, then technologies will have to evolve. Industries and investors will have to figure out a way, and they will, and not later. The earlier the policy signal is clear, and that's why the power of policy signals is extremely important to highlight the power of these. So as if these signals are credible and clear, then investors and business people and decision makers will find these technologies. And that's why I think we are moving in the right direction, because many countries, many leaders are in fact sort of redefining the climate debate and making it much more specific, rather than the larger deep decarbonization kind of debate. And I think we are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, there are some other questions which I had missed, but I have now realized that. One is that what are we going to do about the demand side, consumer behavior? And my answer to that would be that if India is doing a lot of things on demand side management and energy efficiency in our NDC target program, is going to achieve really almost 1/3 to 1/4 or 1/3 to 1 of the reduction in emissions is we are hoping to get it from various demand side, like putting house, ECBC kind of energy compliant building code. We have perform achievement rate for this. Government has pushed in low carbon strategy, Business Bureau of Energy Efficiency is pushing all kinds of products and supporting low carbon, high rated things. Though what Vaibhav said is very critical here in terms of training people, and particularly the service sector, informal service sector, to do the job as efficiently as possible. And I think, so there are a lot of things one can be done. However, taking very millions of people to make that behavioral change is really very difficult for most countries. And we have seen that even in the United States or Europe, the behavioral changes have taken a long time to permeate. Even now, I think the wasteful energy use is quite rampant in US. As on my occasional visit to the United States, I see people behaving that way. So I'm not sure that it is so easy to make people change their behavior. It is a lot easier to make them incentivize to adopt efficient low carbon strategies, which then is consistent with their behavior, but it certainly helps you reduce this. One of the questions that is also asked is that why hasn't India, has putting all kinds of emission standards, but not on CO2 emissions? And I think anybody wants to take that question, my answer to that would be that CO2 emission standards are extremely difficult to implement on very many small users, but we could certainly have it on a larger scale. And in a sense, when you say we have a renewable portfolio obligation to power sector discoms, it is a CO2, you could say in a sense, a constraint on them. So I think anyone else?
Can I come in, Dr. Parikh?
Yeah, please, Dr. Sarma.
Yeah, I think that there is a clear case that CAFE emission requirements, which were released in 2017, gave the industry time till 2022 April, March actually, to have a cap on emissions of 130 grams per kilometer. And they're supposed to be revised from 1st April 2022. to 113 grams per kilometer. So these are carbon emissions really. Carbon emissions, and carbon emissions will include carbon dioxide emissions as well. So that would really cater to the point that is made that carbon dioxide emissions are not controlled. That's it.
Yeah,
I'd make a contribution here.
Yeah, please.
So the other way of doing it, thank you. So the other way of doing it is there's more than 50 companies in India who have an internal price on carbon. So while there isn't a mandated standard on carbon emissions for industry, they've put their own price, and that's, you know, a market signal is a really strong way to drive change. And there's a debate going on between India and other countries about pricing carbon. That's the trend that we're moving globally. So,
that's 15 minutes. Okay, I think we have more or less come to the end, and I'm supposed to summarize some of this discussion, but I think the discussion has been so rich, and I find that what has really been pointed out and what is new here is that, yes, we have to make cooperation with other countries, and not just South-South cooperation, but also with North-South is important. And access to capital and access to technology is critical in all things. Countries are willing to move towards a low carbon development growth, but they need to work. They also, South Asian countries worry about also human development aspect and inclusive growth aspect as well. And pointed out is that training is very critical, particularly the informal sector service workers should be trained into various things, because we have been always looking at the larger issues of bigger companies and supply side. I would also like to add one more observation, which is that which we have not discussed, is that climate change has brought in a large amount of stress due to extreme events which are already here, and one needs to cooperate in a very effective way to deal with this, and also to adapt to these threats of extreme events. And here I think global cooperation and responsibilities are extremely critical. With this, I think I can safely say that we have discussed this. As some of the chats say, that it was a very informative program. So I feel happy that we are more or less in time, given that the earlier presentation had taken too long and we had started 20 minutes late. So I have finished it in time as far as the time I was allocated. So Monali.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parikh, and for a great summarization, and to all the panel members for excellent discussions, and also to our presenters earlier for a great presentation. We did go over a little bit of time, but the discussion was so enriching and interesting that at least I found it very interesting, and I see a lot of participants still hanging around and posing questions. I would like to quickly, say my thanks to all the panel members who took time and joined us today. Dr. Parikh for moderating and chairing today's session. Dr. Sarwan, Vaibhav, Mr. Surakshana Jayavardhane, Mr. Akhtar, Joe. Thank you so much for joining us today. To the presenters, Nikit, David, Shah, thank you. And most importantly, let me thank our organizers who facilitated all the event today. Now, our team from SAREH, Pramod, Ipshita, Atul, thank you so much for coordinating this event. And thanks to all the participants who have, stuck around for this very interesting and enriching discussion. Thank you so much, and thanks to my colleague Julia also for joining in and delivering the welcome remarks, and to the entire SAGE and SAREH team. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good day and good night.
Thank you, USAID and SAREH and others for inviting all of us and organizing this. Thank you all. So good night, and I think all of you should stay safe and stay positive as well as stay negative.
Absolutely makes sense. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Parikh.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.